You are born on October 15th, 1844, in a small village named Racken, nestled in the Prussian province of Saxony. The day of your birth is bright, and your parents take it as a sign. You are named Friedrich Wilhelm Nietzsche, after the Prussian king Friedrich Wilhelm IV, whose birthday you share. Your family is steeped in the tradition of Lutheran Christianity. Your father, Karl Ludwig Nietzsche, is a Lutheran pastogental, bookish, pious. Your mother, Franziska, is devout and strong in the face of hardship, and you are the first child of what will be 3. Your house is calm, full of the steady quiet that comes with faith and routine. But outside, the world is loud with change. The German states are not yet a unified nation. They are a collection of kingdoms, principalities, and city-states ruled by different powers. Life is not easy for the average person. Disease, poverty, and unrest haunt the lower classes. Revolutions are brewing across Europe, whispers of a world reordered. But in your home, everything feels orderly and protected until it isn't. You are not yet 5 when your world is split. Your father, whom you adore, begins to suffer. He complains of headaches, blindness creeps in, and then his mind starts to slip. He hallucinates. He speaks in broken sentences. The sickness takes him with a terrifying swiftness. Some say it is a brain tumor. Others whisper it is hereditary madness. You do not understand. All you know is that your father, your pillar, is gone. He dies in 1849 when you are only 4.5. A year later, Joseph dies too. The grief runs like a flood through your home. Your mother, Franziska, is left a widow at 25 with 2 small children. You and your younger sister, Elizabeth. You are sent to live in Nuremberg with your mother, your grandmother, and 2 aunts. The house becomes a matriarchist, rigid, and deeply religious. It is a world of women and prayer, of mourning, and quiet duty. You are a sensitive child, unusually serious, already turning inward. There is music in you, and language, and a growing awareness of something sharp and cold in the world. You begin your education early. You are quick, curious, and already obsessed with ideas. At the age of 14, you win a scholarship to the prestigious Schulfurter, a boarding school known for producing the intellectual elite of Germany. It is here that your hunger for knowledge sharpens into something more intense. You learn Latin and Greek, read the Bible in the original languages, and begin to grapple with the ancients Homer, Plato, Aeschylus, Sophocles. You fall in love with the Greeks. You are quiet, isolated, sometimes mocked for your seriousness, but inside you are building an inner citadel of thought. Outside the walls of the school, Germany is shifting. The failed revolutions of 1848 have left a bitter residue in the hearts of many. The dream of a unified Germany is smoldering under the surface. There is talk of nationalism, identity, and culture, but it has not yet taken shape. The shadow of war is distant but growing. You leave Schulfurter in 1864, a young man of 20, and enroll at the University of Bonn to study theology and philology. At first, you try to please your family. Theology seems appropriate the path your father walked, but it is not long before something inside you begins to resist. You begin to question the faith you were raised in. You read David Strauss and Ludwig Feuerbach. The idea that God is a human projection sinks its hooks into you. The church no longer feels like home. You break with Christianity, not loudly, not dramatically, but deeply and permanently. You transfer to the University of Leipzig to study philology in earnest. There, you meet the man who will shape you perhaps more than any other, Arthur Schwelbenhauer. You discover the world as will and representation, and it is like a lightning strike. Schopenhauer's vision of life as driven by blind, insatiable will resonates with your own experiences of suffering and desire. He offers no redemption, only honesty. You are moved by his pessimism, not because it is bleak, but because it feels true. At Leipzig, you also begin to explore the works of Friedrich Albert Langer, whose history of materialism opens your eyes to the scientific and psychological dimensions of philosophy. Your ideas start to churn beneath the surface. You are not yet a philosopher, but the raw material is forming. Then, a moment of recognition comes. At just 24, your talent is so clear, your brilliance so undeniable, that you are offered a professorship in classical philology at the University of Basel, in Switzerland, before you have even completed your doctorate. This is extraordinary. You are the youngest ever to receive such a position. You accept. You move to Basel in 1869, stepping into the world of academia. But war interrupts. In 1870, the Franco-Prussian War breaks out. You volunteer as a medical orderly. You are not a soldier, but you serve at the front, witnessing firsthand the horror of modern warfare. You see limbs shattered, men scream, and blood soak the earth. You are sickened, both physically and spiritually. The experience nearly kills you. You contract diphtheria and dysentery. You return to Basel, changed, shaken, and increasingly disillusioned. It is during these years that your relationship with Richard Wagner deepens. You had met Wagner, the composer, a few years earlier. He is everything you admire, bold, passionate, German to the core. Wagner becomes a surrogate father, a guiding star to visit him and his wife Cosima often. And for a time you are drawn into their world of art, myth, and German nationalism. You even dedicate your first book, The Birth of Tragedy, 1872, to him. But not everyone welcomes the book. It is unorthodox. It fuses philology with philosophy, myth with music. It praises Dionysus, the god of chaos, instinct, and ecstasy over the rational Apollo. It is a declaration of war against the sterile logic of modern thought. Your academic colleagues recoil. Your reputation suffers. Some dismiss you as a mystic, others as a charlatan. Still, you persist. Yet, as the years pass, your relationship with Wagner begins to fray. You sense in Wagner a growing alignment with nationalism, Christianity, and anti-Semitism ideologies. You reject. You begin to see him not as a revolutionary, taught us, but as a demagogue, the break is slow and painful. It culminates with your book Human, All Too Human, 1878, a clear renunciation of metaphysics, religion, and Wagner's romanticism. It is a book of aphorisms, cool and sharp like glass. Wagner reads it. He is wounded. The friendship dissolves. Your health continues to deteriorate. You suffer from blinding headaches, vomiting, insomnia, and near constant pain. You are forced to take frequent leaves from your position at Basel. Eventually, in 1879, you resign altogether. You are only 34. You are now a wanderer. You have no permanent home, no stable income. You live in boarding houses across Switzerland, Italy, and France, chasing climates that might ease your suffering. You are almost always alone. Your sight is failing. You cannot tolerate light. You cannot eat most foods. Yet you write with increasing power. In the 1880s, your major works pour out in a torrent. The gay science, thus spoke Zarathustra, beyond good and evil, the genealogy of morals. In these books, your thought crystallizes. You declare that God is dead, not as a triumph, but as a terrifying realization. The moral order of the West has collapsed, and nothing stands in its place. You warn that nihilism is coming, and that without new values, civilization may rot from the inside. You call for the bemenschter Overmanners, one who might create new values, who might live beyond good and evil. But the world does not understand. Your books sell poorly. Critics ignore or mock you. You are alone, sick, half-blind, and writing for a future that may never come. You write not to be famous, but because something burns inside you and cannot be silenced. Your life becomes one of solitude and visionary torment. The years pass. You are now in your early 40s, and your body feels older than it should. The pain is constant, like a low growl inside your skull that never sleeps. You wake with it, eat with it, write with it. Your stomach rebels against food. You live on milk, bread, and the occasional egg. You retreat higher into the Alps in the summer, to places like Sils Maria, where the air is thin and pure. It is here, amid the icy stillness of the mountains, that the clearest moments come visions, you might call them. In 1881, while walking beside Lake Sip, a single thought strikes you with such force that you stagger. What if everything in life, every moment, must return again? Endlessly, exactly as it once did. This becomes the eternal recurrence, your most haunting idea. If time is infinite, bend matter finite, then all things must recur. Every joy, every sorrow, again and again, forever. It is not a doctrine for comfort. It is a test. Can you embrace your life so fully that you would will it to return eternally, without changing a single thing? This idea, along with the death of God and the Overman, becomes the backbone of your magnum opus. Thus spoke Zarathustra. You pour yourself into this work. It is not philosophy as others write. It is a hymn, a gospel, a poetic firestorm. You invent a prophet, Zarathustra, a solitary sage who descends from the mountains to teach the world a new vision of life. He speaks in riddles, parables, fierce truths. The work is deeply misunderstood. Most who read it dismiss it as madness. But you know what you are doing. You are preparing humanity for what is coming, a world without divine order, where value must be created, not inherited. You send copies to friends and former colleagues, but few respond. You begin to suspect correctly that you are becoming one of those thinkers who are not of their time. You live in obscurity, a failed academic, a sickly hermit scribbling into notebooks. You often write standing up because sitting makes your headaches worse. You are nearly blind, so your writing leans forward, close to the paper, often shaky and cramped. In 1886, you self-publish Beyond Good and Evil. It is a direct assault on the complacency of European morality. You reject the idea of absolute good and evil. You argue that values are expressions of power, of strength, weakness, resentment. You dissect the psychology of the moral man, the religious man, the philosopher. You call for a new kind of thinker, one who is willing to look at the world without illusion, who can face the abyss without flinching. Your relationship with your sister Elizabeth is strained. She does not understand your work, your atheism, your contempt for nationalism and anti-Semitism. In fact, she is married to Bernhard Faster, a fervent nationalist and anti-Semite. The two of them even attempt to found a pure Aryan colony, in Paraguay, which ends in failure and Faster's suicide. Elizabeth returns to Germany a widow, and you watch with increasing discomfort as she grows more entrenched in the ideas you despise. Yet still you write. In 1887, you publish the genealogy of morals, a companion to Beyond Good and Evil. It is more direct, more aggressive. You argue that modern morality is not noble, but born from resentment, that the concept of sin was invented by the weak to poison the strong, that guilt, conscience, and pity are symptoms of cultural decay. These are not comfortable truths, but they are your truths. And then, in 1888, a final blaze. Despite your failing health, you write with astonishing speed and clarity. You produce 4 books in a single year. The Case of Wagner, Twilight of the Idols, The Antichrist, and Ecce Homo. Each is a hammer blow against what you see as the lies of Western culture. You tear down Christianity in The Antichrist, calling it the religion of pity, of weakness, of life denial. You describe Christ as a misunderstood figure, and Paul as the true founder of Christianity, a man who turned a moment of weakness into a global system of guilt and submission. And Ecce Homo, you finally speak directly of yourself, your life, your sufferings, your mission. The title means "Behold the man," echoing the words spoken by Pontius Pilate. It is part autobiography, part confession, part prophecy. You describe your works, your solitude, your rejection by the world. You call yourself a destiny, but something is cracking. The strain, both physical and mental, is becoming unbearable. You are exhausted. You feel yourself on the edge. The headaches worsen. Your writing becomes erratic. You begin to believe you are being followed, spied upon. Letters become manic, full of delusions and grandiose declarations. You sign them Dionysus or the Crucified, and then, in January 1889, in Turin, something inside you breaks. You are walking through the Piazza Carlo Alberto when you see a horse being whipped by its owner. Something in the animal's suffering overwhelms you. You run to it, throw your arms round its neck, and collapse sobbing. Afterward, you fall silent. You are led back to your room, but you never return to the world of the sane. What follows is years of mental darkness. Your mother takes you in. You live in a half-conscious fog, mostly silent, sometimes singing or weeping, sometimes screaming. Your genius is gone, burned out like a star. You no longer write. You no longer think in words. Your mother cares for you with quiet devotion, until her death in 1897. Then Elizabeth, your sister, takes control of your legacy and distorts it. She censors your unpublished writings, cuts, rearranges, and sometimes rewrites them. She publishes your notebooks under the misleading title The Will to Power, framing your ideas in terms of German nationalism and racial superiority. She courts the rising forces of authoritarianism, aligning your name with ideologies you despised. In life, you become, falsely, a favorite of the Nazis. But you are no longer there to object. You die on August 25th, 1900, in Weimar, a silent, forgotten man. You are 55. The world has not yet heard you, but they will. In the decades that follow, your work begins to rise. Artists, writers, philosophers, Kafka, Freud, Jung Camus, Foucault read you, cite you, wrestle with you. Some misunderstand you, some misuse you, but many recognize in your writings something rare, the raw, burning truth of a man who looked into the abyss and chose to speak. Your words outlive the misinterpretations. Slowly, the world begins to understand what you meant not to destroy, but to transform. Not to despair, but to create. You had no children, no marriage, no empire, no wealth. You had pain, solitude, and a vision. But in time, you became a name that shook the world. Your death in 1900 passes quietly. There are no obituaries in the major German papers, no memorials, no state honors. Put, you are buried in the churchyard of your birth village, Rakan, beneath the steeple your father once preached beneath, a small grave, a few mourners. The world doesn't know yet what has been lost or what has been left behind, but the seeds are there in the years that follow. Your sister Elizabeth builds a shrine to your memory. She turns the Nietzsche archive in Weimar into both a museum and a propaganda machine. She edits your letters, rewrites your fragments, selectively publishes from your notebooks. She wants to present you as a prophet of German greatness, of Aryan superiority, of nationalism. She invites guests, philosophers, authors, even royalty, and wraps them in a narrative of you that is carefully shaped, filtered, twisted, You had written against anti-Semitism, against German nationalism, against the herd instinct, against the state. But your sister ignores all that. She crafts a myth. Nietzsche, the philosopher of the Reich. Nietzsche, the voice of power, conquest, and blood. And this myth takes hold dangerously. So, in the 1920s and 30s, your work is rediscovered by a new generation. Some sincerely, others opportunistically. The existentialists Jean-Paul Sartre, Albert Camus, Simone de Beauvoir read you and see a map for a post-Christian world. They take your questions seriously. What do we do now that God is dead? How do we live without fixed values? How do we create meaning in a void? Others, like Martin Heidegger, interpret you through their own dense systems, placing you within the history of metaphysics. Heidegger sees your notion of the will to power as both a culmination and a crisis in Western thought. He says, "You are the last metaphysician, though you tried so hard to break metaphysics entirely." But then come the fascists. The Nazis take power in 1933. Hitler visits your archive. Elizabeth gives him a copy of your works, wrapped in red leather. She praises him, claiming you and he are kin. This is the deepest betrayal. You, who despised anti-Semitism and called nationalism a sickness. You, who said that the state is the coldest of all cold monsters. Your name becomes entangled with the regime wrongly, falsely, tragically. Your words are twisted into weapons. You are used to justify brutality, but truth survives corruption. After the Second World War, scholars begin to reclaim your thought. They return to your original writings, not your sister's forgeries or the Nazi interpretations. They read your actual words. They find something radically different, not a preacher of hate, but a philosopher of freedom, a psychologist of the human soul, a writer who understood that we are driven by deep instincts, that we wear masks to survive, that morality is born not from divinity, but from power struggles and historical wounds. They see that your work is not a system, but a confrontation, a mirror held up to civilization, a challenge to lazy thinking, to inherited dogma. You do not tell people what to believe. You ask if they have ever truly chosen what they believe. You are not a builder of new temples. You are a destroyer of illusions. In the 1950s and 60s, your ideas echo through art, literature, and philosophy. Carl Jung calls you a pioneer of depth psychology. He sees in your work a map of the unconscious, a warning about what happens when we repress the darker aspects of the self. You had written of masks, shadows, instincts. Jung brings these too. Life in his language of archetypes and the shadow self in America. Your ideas inspire the beat poets, the counterculture, the rebellious spirit of those who question authority. In France, Michel Foucault and Jacques Derrida draw from your genealogical method, tracing the hidden power structures in language, medicine, sexuality, and punishment. You had shown them that ideas are not pure. They are born from struggle, desire, fear, even in theology. Where you pronounced God dead, you leave a lasting impact. Some theologians try to answer you. Others admit you've reshaped the question entirely. They realize faith must now grapple not with doubt, but with nihilism. Your language is strange, lyrical, explosive. You do not write like Kant or Hegel. You write like a poet with dynamite. You use aphorisms because truth, you believe, cannot be captured in linear prose. It must be glimpsed, felt, burned into the soul. You ask questions that hurt. You say, "What does your conscience say?" You shall become the person you are. And again, he who has a why to live can bear almost any how. You are quoted, studied, worshipped, condemned. People often misunderstand you. They think you praise the Bemensch as a tyrant. They forget he is the one who creates new values, not the one who dominates others. You never defined him in full-on purpose. You wanted readers to struggle to shape their own vision of that higher self, that you are not a nihilist. You fought nihilism every day of your life. You saw it coming, saw the collapse of old truths and the emptiness it would leave. And you warned, unless we learn to create, to affirm life even in its cruelty, we will sink. You did not want people to worship suffering, but to grow from it, to become strong because of it, not in spite of it. You wrote, "What does not kill me makes me stronger." But this was not bravado. It was a confession. Most of what didn't kill you left you broken, bleeding, nearly mad. But you found, in suffering, a forge. You were trying to tell the world that strength is not domination, is self-overcoming. Your work, for all its darkness, is not despairing. It is deeply life-affirming. You loved life wildly, fiercely, tragically. You wrote of dancing, of music, of laughter. You said, "I would only believe in a God who could dance." You saw the absurdity of existence, and rather than weep, you chose to sing. Even as your mind unraveled, your final letters spoke of joy, of cosmic laughter, of love for eternity. You had loved once Lou Andreas, Salome, brilliant, independent, the only woman who matched your mind. But she turned you down. You had asked her to marry you 3 times. She said no. It crushed you. She would go on to become a thinker, a psychoanalyst, a muse to Rilke and Freud. But she always carried a piece of you with her. She saw your madness before the world did. She called it the purest flame of thought I have ever encountered. You had no disciples in your lifetime, but now you are everywhere. You are on the bookshelves of students and poets. You are debated in lecture halls, quoted in therapy rooms, echoed in films, art, even video games, in psychology, philosophy, cultural studies. You have become one of the most cited thinkers in human history. A man who spent much of his life unread, unloved, isolated now, read in hundreds of languages. You wanted to be a bridge between what humanity was and what it could become. You wanted to tear down idols so something new could rise. You did not offer salvation. You offered honesty, and you paid for it. You were broken by the weight of your vision. You lived in pain, both physical and spiritual. You lost your mind before. The world ever gave you recognition. You died not knowing you would become a voice for the modern age. But you were right. God died. Morality collapsed. Nihilism came. And in the ruins, people turned back to your words, searching for what comes next. Friedrich Nietzsche, born in the quiet of Racken, died in the silence of Weimar, lived in agony, wrote in fire, saw the future, and dared to speak. Your voice does not end with your death. It deepens. It moves like a current through the decades, pulling minds into its undertow. What you wrote was not a system, it was a confrontation, not just with the world, but with the self. You said, "Become who you are." And you meant it with every vein and nerve and shattered moment of your life. That phrase is simple, but it is terrifying, because it means no one else can tell you what your path is. No priest, no philosopher, no parent, no nation. You must carve it yourself, through trial, through fire. After the Second World War, as Europe reeled from the horrors it had unleashed, your name was heavy with suspicion. The shadow of Nazism clung to it. Scholars argued. Was Nietzsche a proto-fascist? Was he insane all along? Or was he, in fact, the man who saw it all coming and shouted his warnings into a void that wasn't ready to listen? Slowly, carefully, the scholars who took the time to read Nietzsche just quote, "You began to lift that weight." Walter Kaufmann, a refugee from Nazi Germany, played a key role in the English-speaking world. In the 1950s and 60s, he translated your works with care, context, and fidelity. He exposed the distortions introduced by Elizabeth. He showed the world a different Nietzsche, the Nietzsche of passion, integrity, and fire not of racial hatred. In that clearing, your thought breathed again. In the second half of the 20th century, your influence became almost untraceably wide. You were no longer just a philosopher. You were an event, a weather system moving across the soul of the West. The existentialists clung to your courage. Camus found in you a brother, someone who faced the absurd and chose defiance. Sartre took pure idea of creating values and turned it into the cornerstone of his philosophy. In psychology, Freud had already felt your influence, even if he rarely admitted it. You had written that human beings are driven by subterranean forces, instincts, fears, repressed desires. You had said, there are no moral phenomena, only moral interpretations. Freud built a whole discipline around the unconscious. Jung, more directly, read you closely. He saw in you the forerunner of depth psychology, the man who named the shadow, the mask, the war inside the self. Artists took your words as fuel. Kafka, alienated and spectral, wandered through the same spiritual wasteland you described. Rilke, who knew Lou Salome as well, drank in your vision of the eternal, of the tragic beautiful. Thomas Mann weaved you into his novels. Dr. Faustus, Pierre is soaked in your ghosts. Musicians, dancers, painters, found in your Dionysian spirit something that modernity had starved them of: ecstasy. Chaos, blood, wildness, and always, always, that warning hums underneath your words. He who fights with monsters should take care lest he thereby become a monster. And if you gaze long into the abyss gazes also into you. That line, perhaps your most quoted, was not just poetry. It was your life. You did stare into the abyss, into suffering, madness, godlessness, despair. You saw where modernity is heading, mechanization of life, worship of the herd, flattening of value. You saw the risk of man becoming too reasonable, too tame, too dull. You didn't want more cruelty. You wanted more greatness. Not dominance, but nobility. Not superiority over others, but the sovereignty of self-mastery. Your idea of the will to power is often misunderstood. People imagine you meant domination, but you never equated power with mere control. For you, power was the deep creative urge to shape, to overcome, to grow, to make of chaos something beautiful. The artist is a greater expression of the will, to power than the tyrant, the dancer more than the general dot you had written. Art is the proper task of life, and you meant it. You did not believe life had meaning in the traditional sense, not given from above. But you believed we could make it beautiful, like a sculpture carved out of stone. Your vision was not of salvation. It was of transformation. And yet, despite all the fire in your writing, loneliness never left you. You had friends for a while. Some were great minds. Paul Reed, Franz, Overbeck, Lou, Salome. But you always stood just a little too far outside the circle, too intense, too independent. You burned through friendships the way you burned through your body with too much voltage. Even your love life was marked by pain. Lou, whom you loved with a deep, almost desperate longing, saw in you a brilliance but not a future. She was fierce, young, fearless. You proposed to her multiple times. She refused each time, and worse, she stayed close, friendly, intellectual. She traveled with you and the three of you formed a strange triangle, part philosophical salon, part unspoken agony. You felt betrayed. You broke with both of them. You wrote that a philosopher should not marry, that love was too chaotic, too intoxicating. But the wound was there. It bled into your work, into your bitterness, your solitude. By the time you reached your final years of writing, you were in open war with the world. You wrote the Antichrist in a fervent, all-out assault on Christianity, not the historical Jesus whom you admired, but the institution, the morality of weakness, the glorification of suffering, the hatred of the body. You called it a sickness. Christianity is a rebellion against natural instincts, you wrote. It is a protest against nature, carried to the logical extreme. It would mean the systematic cultivation of the human failure. That book could not be published in your lifetime. It was too dangerous, too honest, too fierce, and exe homo. Your final lucid work, it reads like a man who knew he was running out of time. It is at once a defense, a confession, and a blaze of self-affirmation. You write chapter titles like Why I Am So Wise, Why I Am So Clever, Why I Write Such Good Books. It sounds like arrogance, but it is something deeper, a last attempt to speak truth before silence. Took you, and silence did come. When the collapse came in Turin, it was sudden. After that you would spend more than a decade alive, but not living. A husk, your days blurred together. Sometimes you played piano, sometimes you smiled, but you were gone. Your mind had burned itself out, and it took years of distortion, bond of silence, of abuse before the world began to listen to what you actually said. But now they do. They read you in classrooms, in bedrooms, in prison cells, in studios. They write dissertations about you. They paint you. They whisper your words when they feel the ground fall out from under them, when they question everything, when they wonder how to live in a world that no longer gives them answers because you lived that question. You walked that path, and you paid for it with your mind, your health, your peace. But in doing so, you gave something immeasurable. Not comfort, not certainty, but courage. And your words remain still. You must have chaos within you to give birth to a dancing star. And so your words stretch forward, Friedrich, across generations that could not have imagined your world of gaslight and horse carts, and yet somehow feel your soul in theirs. That line about the dancing star born from chaos becomes a kind sigh of silent prayer for people on the edge. The artist at midnight, the philosopher staring into the dark, the lost youth with nothing solid to believe in. They find something in you, not hope in the soft sense, but a deeper, sharper blade, the will to endure, to create, to affirm. But it isn't simple. Reading you is never simple, because you don't let anyone stay comfortable. You wrote that philosophy should be dangerous, like a knife held to the throat of culture. You never argued for argument's sake. You wrote because your mind was burning. You wrote because the alternative was silence and despair. And that makes your words pulse. They come alive not on the page, but in the reader wherever someone dares to truly wrestle with them. And your wrestling was lifelong, even as a young man. You were obsessed with truth, but not the sterile truth of equations or the comfortable truth of faith. You want the truth behind truth, the kind that stares back, that doesn't blink, that costs something. You saw early on that the truths people build their lives on, religion, morality, tradition, were often nothing more than scaffolding to keep the chaos out. But you believed in looking through that scaffolding until your eyes adjusted to the dark. You trained yourself to do this, and it cost you everything. Even in your student years, you studied too hard, too long. You tore into Greek grammar, classical texts, the roots of culture. You devoured languages, devoured music, devoured philosophy. But already your body was failing. Already you were in pain. You wrote to friends about your migraines, your stomach, your eyes, your crushing fatigue. Sometimes you could only work 15 minutes a day, but you worked anyway. When you taught in Basel, you gave everything to your students. You were shy, often sick, but those who paid attention saw your brilliance. Not everyone liked you. Some thought you too intense, too abstract, too dark, but others saw the flicker of something rare, a soul unafraid to say the unsayable. You hated the pedantry of academia, the safety, the pretense of objectivity. You were never objective. You cared too much. You believed too much, and that made you dangerous in a field that liked its ideas cold and clean. It's no accident you left the university. You were ill but also restless. Your ideas had outgrown the classroom. You were no longer a scholar. You were a thinker of the future, a philosopher-poet, a hammer, a heretic. And that's when the books began to pour out of you. Human. All too human your Declaration of Independence. Aphorisms, short and sharp, cutting away sentimentality, metaphysics, and illusion. Then the gay science, where you wrote that terrifying phrase, God is dead. You didn't say it with pride. You said it like someone whispering over a corpse. Not triumph, but aftermath. The death of God meant the death of the entire moral framework of Europe. And you knew that most people weren't ready to live in that shadow. That they would run back to old lies or forward into new ones. That's why you created Zarathustra. He wasn't just a character. He was a mouth for the fire inside you. He was the prophet of your deepest vision, that we must become creators of value, that the old gods are gone, and we are now the makers of meaning, not collectively, not by committee, but individually. Alone, and the world was not ready for Zarathustra. They mocked him, ignored him. You sent copies to former friends, former colleagues, and were met with silence. No one understood what you were doing. No one saw what you were pointing to. It was as if you were speaking into a century that hadn't arrived yet. The century came, and with it, war, ideology, collapse, atom bombs, mass death. Everything you foresaw. You had said, convictions are more dangerous enemies of truth than lies. You watched in horror as entire nations became possessed by convictions, by ideologies that turned people into machines. And yet you had already predicted it, already warned that in the absence of God, people would turn to idols, nations, races, ideologies, causes, and that these new gods would demand more blood than the old ones ever did. So when your name was co-opted by those monsters, it was a tragedy beyond words, a reversal of everything you stood for, because you didn't want people to follow. You wanted them to stand. You didn't want obedience. You wanted honesty. You wanted people to live without masks, without inherited virtue, without fear. You wanted to break people open so that something new could grow inside them, not the Bermensch as a dictator, but as a creator, a builder of self. A being who says yes to life, even to its pain, even to its absurdity. But saying yes is hard. You knew that your entire life was a war between your philosophy and your suffering. You didn't live on mountaintops of joy. You lived in valleys. Pain. You were lonely, chronically ill, rejected, forgotten. You begged publishers to print your books. You sent letters pleading for reviews. You dreamed of reaching an audience, but they didn't come. Not while you were alive, and yet you kept writing, because something in you knew. Your audience was not in your time. You once wrote, Some are born posthumously. You were one of them. A mind so far ahead that even your own century had to die before it could hear you. Now you're read by millions. But you are not easy reading. You challenge, confuse, provoke. You contradict yourself. You speak in riddles. One line, you praise strength. The next, you confess your own weakness. One page, you mock pity. The next, you weep for a horse. You contain multitudes. Bend, that's what makes you true. Because you never gave us answers. You gave us mirrors, and those mirrors are still breaking people open, even now. People turn to you in times of collapse, in personal crises, in moments when the stories they were raised on stop working. You don't offer comfort, you offer fire. You offer freedom. You say, burn down what you are and see what survives. And that's terrifying, but also beautiful. You believed that life, even in its horror, was worth affirming, not just surviving, not just enduring, but saying yes to it, deeply, fully, tragically. You wrote, Amor Fati. Let that be my love from now on. I do not want to wage war against what is ugly. I do not want to accuse. I do not even want to accuse the accusers. Looking away shall be my only negation. And all in all, and on the whole, some day I wish to be only a yes-sayer, and that wish, in some quiet way, has come true. Because your voice still speaks, and in those moments when someone's somewhere chooses to face the abyss and step forward anyway, your spirit walks with them. You died in obscurity, but your life, your suffering, your thinking, your madness, it mattered. It still does, and it always will. Because in the end, what you gave wasn't a doctrine to be followed, was a challenge, put to be met, a test of soul, a call across the void asking not for believers, but for creators. You did not seek to be worshipped, Friedrich. You wanted to be overcome. You even said it. One repays a teacher badly if one remains only a pupil. You didn't want disciples. You wanted people to think dangerously, to live on the edge of becoming, to burn away the falseness of their lives until only the essential remained. And for that, for refusing to be safe, suffered more than most. The days after Turin were long and strange. You had collapsed in 1889. But your body would not die for another 11 years. 11 years of silence. 11 years of being watched, fed, bathed. Sometimes you sang. Sometimes you clapped. Sometimes you stared into nothing. The man who once wrote with the fire of Dionysus now sat in a chair, his eyes dull, his mouth slack, his hands fumbling. You were still alive, but the world inside, youth, the world you built with words and blood and fury, was gone. Your mother, Franziska, cared for you with quiet devotion. She believed, perhaps, that her son was being punished by God for his heresies. Yet she never turned away. She stayed until her death in 1897. Then your sister, Elizabeth, took over not out of love, but ambition. By then, your name was beginning to stir in the philosophical underground. There were whispers of this madman who had written strange, beautiful books that no one understood. Young readers were picking up Zarathustra and being transformed or disturbed. But Elizabeth saw something else, an opportunity. She built the Nietzsche archive in Weimar into a kind of temple, a myth-making factory. She wore black, played the grieving sister, and curated your legacy the way one curates a political campaign. She edited your letters. She cut and pasted from your notebooks to create the will to power, a book you never authorized, never finished, and never intended to publish in that form. But she made it your masterwork. She gave it a title that sounded like ideology, and the world listened. And then came Hitler. He arrived like a fever in the German soul, promising unity, strength, rebirth, and your sister handed him your name like a weapon. She gave him copies of your books. She spoke of you as the philosopher of the new Reich. She let his propagandists twist your words into calls for racial purity, conquest, and violence. It is the cruelest irony, you, who despised nationalism. You who warned against the madness of crowds, of the herd. You who believed the state was an impersonal machine that crushed the individual. You who called anti-Semitism a sign of low culture and bitterness. You who were closer in spirit to a wandering mystic than a politician. But you could not speak. You could not protest. You were already dead. So for a time the world remembered you as something you were not, but not forever. After the war, the silence shattered. Scholars returned to your actual writings. They read the lackluster notebooks from the original, not the edited, mangled versions. They saw what you had really said. They saw the difference between the Nietzsche created by Elizabeth and Nietzsche, who had lived and suffered and written, and walked alone through the Alps, and that Nietzsche, the real one, rose again. He was more complex than they imagined, more lyrical, more tragic, more human. You were not a cynic. You were not a monster. You were not a nihilist. You were a man who had lost everything, faith, health, love, and yet still said yes to life. You had every reason to hate the world, but instead you tried to remake it. You turned pain into poetry, isolation into vision, proffering into style. You wrote with your body, with your nerves, with the full agony of being conscious in a world that doesn't care. And you still believed something beautiful could emerge. You believed in eternal recurrence, not as a theory, of time, but as a spiritual trial. You asked if you had to live this life exactly as it is, again and again, for all eternity, would you still say yes? Most people could not, but you tried to. You wrote, "My formula for greatness in a human being is more fatty, that one wants nothing to be different, not forward, not backward, not in all eternity, not merely to bear what is necessary, still less conceal it, but to love it. That is not the voice of a tyrant. That is not the voice of a fascist. That is the voice of a soul on fire, burning alone, refusing to look away from the horror, and still saying, I choose this and now. Long after your death, that fire has caught in others. You are read not because people agree with you, but because you cannot be ignored. You force them to question their deepest assumptions. You force them to look at themselves. You force them to ask what it means to be alive without illusions. And in a time when belief is crumbling, when systems are faltering, when people feel unmoored, your words feel like flares in the dark. You do not guide, you ignite. You are not a father of answers. You are a god of dangerous questions. Your shadow moves through literature, philosophy, psychology, theology, art, politics, even science. Wherever people ask what it means to choose, to create, to endure, you are there. You live in the lines people underline in despair, in the quotes scribbled in the margins of notebooks during a nervous breakdown, in the music made by those who refuse to conform, in the rebellion of those who choose truth over comfort, in the solitude of those who walk away from the herd and ask, what if I became something else? You died alone, but now you are everywhere, because your truth was not meant to console the world. It was meant to awaken it, and it still is, and still the world keeps turning, spinning through wars and empires and ideologies, drawn, claiming to offer meaning, only to collapse into dust. But through each collapse, through every cultural tremor and existential scream, you are there, Friedrich, not offering safety, not giving easy answers, but waiting quietly, fiercely for those few who are ready to confront the hardest truths. You're not a comforter, you're a fire starter. You saw what few dared to see, that once the old gods are dead, the real work begins. Not rebuilding temples, but rebuilding ourselves. That the collapse of belief doesn't lead to despair unless we allow it. It leads to freedom, and freedom is terrifying. You understood that most people don't want freedom. Not really. They say they do, but in truth they want certainty. They want someone to tell them what to value, how to act, who to be. But you saw that as the deepest insult to the human soul. You said, he who cannot obey himself will be commanded. That is the nature of living creatures. And so you turned the knife inward. You asked people not what do you believe, but why do you believe it? Where did that belief come from? Who benefits from it? What if it was born not from reason or truth, but from fear, from resentment, from the need to belong? You taught us to see morality not as eternal law, but as historical strategy. You dissected good and evil like a surgeon, showing that what we call virtue is often the triumph of weakness over strength, of conformity over creativity. You said that Christian morality, for all its high-sounding virtues, was born in the minds of the oppressed, those too powerless to express strength, so they turned it into a sin. You called it the slave revolt in morality, and you were hated for it. They called you blasphemer, madman, monster. But what you were was honest.you told the truth about truth, that it too is a construction, that we cling to our truths because the world without them is unbearable. But if we are brave enough to let go, what we find isn't a void, it's possibility. Creation, you once wrote. We have art in order not to perish from the truth. And in that one line is everything you stood for. Life is too intense, too raw, too strange to face directly. So we dance, we write, we paint, we create, not to escape, but to transform, to take the terror and absurdity of existence and make something beautiful out of it, something ours and for you. Art wasn't luxuried, was necessity. In your most lucid moments, your prose read like symphonies. You turned philosophy into music. You used rhythm, metaphor, poetry, because reason alone couldn't carry what you were trying to say. You needed Dionysus, the god of wine, madness, ecstasy. You needed the pulse of life beneath the words. And in Zarathustra, you gave the world something more than a book. You gave it a riddle, a mirror, a map written in fire. It's a text people don't understand the first time, more the fifth. But they feel it. They know it's saying something too big for words. A prophecy not of doom, but of birth. And that birth, that becoming, is never easy. You never pretended it was. You said becoming who we are is the most difficult task imaginable. That it requires pain, discipline, loneliness, honesty. You said, the snake that cannot shed its skin must perish. And you weren't talking about others, you were talking about yourself. You shed your skin again and again, from the devout pastor's son to the rebellious student, to the tortured professor, to the wanderer, to the madman whispering joy to a silent world. You lived what you taught. You sacrificed everything for your truth. Love, health, belonging, sanity, and in the end, the only thing that survived was the voice. That voice, cold and searing as a blade, compassionate in the deepest sense, not pitying, but demanding. Because you believed in what human beings could become, not what they were. You said, man is a rope stretched between the animal and the overmanner rope over an abyss. And you meant it. You saw the human condition as a tightrope, walk dangerous, absurd, beautiful. Below us, the void. Above us, the stars. You weren't sure anyone could walk it, but you insisted they try. You never wrote for the many. You wrote for the few, those who could not rest with inherited truths, who were willing to suffer for the real thing, who were willing to let go of the handrails and step into the wild dot. And those few, they find you. They find you in moments of collapse, when the worldview they were given starts to crack, when religion fails, when politics fails, when happiness fails, when they are alone, angry, desperate. They find you not as a guide, but as a provocation. You don't tell them what to do. You ask them who they are, and that question echoes in them for the rest of their lives. You have been blamed, worshipped, feared, misunderstood. You have been used to justify things you would have abhorred. And yet your work survives, not because of the myths, but because of the need to face the world without illusion, the need to become more than what we were told we could be, the need to create values, not inherit them, the need to dance, even on the edge of the abyss. And today, you are more alive than you've ever been, in the disillusioned graduate staring at a blank future, in the burned-out worker trying to remember what it feels like to be alive, in the artist pushing past fear to make something real, in the solitary soul who chooses honesty over belonging, in the young philosopher who dares to say, no, this isn't enough. You are there, not as an answer, but as a challenge, as a whisper from the mountains. Become who you are. And the ones who listen, they walk your path. They feel the fire. They hear the silence of the stars. And they say yes. That yes, whispered in the darkness, is where your legacy truly lives, not in the books alone, or in the classrooms, or in the vaults of academia, but in that trembling, private moment when a person looks at their life the whole tangled, wounded, fragile thing and decides not to look away, not to run, not to lie, but to say, yes, this too, even this, especially this. That is what you gave us, and then came Hitler. You weren't a philosopher in the traditional sense. You didn't construct a neat system with definitions and footnotes. You refused to, because you believed that life was too vast for that, too fierce, too dynamic. You said that the greatest thoughts are the thoughts that come while walking, and you meant it. You wrote with your feet, with your lungs, with the mountain wind in your ears. You thought with your whole being, not just your mind. And your writing carries that rhythm. It breathes, it turns, it leaps. Your sentences don't argue, they strike. You don't try to convince, you try to wake. You wanted to pull people out of sleep, out of complacency, out of comfort, even if it meant shocking them, wounding them, offending them. You once wrote, "Some men are born posthumously," but you were also understood posthumously. You knew that the present couldn't hold you. You wrote for the future. And now that future keeps catching up to you, because even now we are living through the very crisis you foretold. The death of absolutes, the rise of relativism, the collapse of tradition, and the desperate scramble to replace it with ideologies, with identity, with distractions. You said, "He who has a why to live can bear almost anyhow." And yet more and more people are losing their why, not because they are weak, but because the old whys are failing. And in that vacuum, the question returns, as sharp as ever. Can we create our own meaning? Can we bear that responsibility? You said yes, but not a soft yes, not a warm yes, a dangerous yes, a hard one yes. You never promised it would be easy. You said that freedom would come at the cost of safety, that truth would come at the cost of belonging, that becoming who we are would come at the cost of everything that once made us feel comfortable and small. And you paid those costs yourself. You didn't just theorize the abyss. You walked through it alone, blind with migraine, crippled by stomach pain, shunned by your peers, rejected by the woman you loved, cut off from your family, misunderstood in your time. You walked through all of that with nothing but your pen and your soul land. You kept writing. You kept saying, yes, dot. And that's why you matter, not because you were perfect. You weren't. You were proud, mercurial, sometimes cruel, sometimes wrong, sometimes inconsistent, but you were honest. You bled your contradictions onto the page. You didn't pretend to have it all figured out. You showed us what it looked like to struggle, to fall, to rise again, not in victory, but in vision. You gave us tools, not commandments. The hammer to smash idols, the mirror to face ourselves, the rope stretched over the abyss, the music, to dance while we walk it. And even now, long after your death, you are still forging people in that fire. Every time someone breaks with the lies they've inherited, every time someone turns away from the herd to listen to their own becoming, every time someone chooses the difficult path of truth over comfort, your spirit flickers, and still the world resists you. Still you are feared. Still you are misquoted, misused, made into slogans, stuck onto posters and Instagram quotes, stripped of depth. But those who truly read you, they know. They feel the heat beneath the words. They sense the grief, the joy, the danger in what be offered. Because it's not a path to happiness. It's a path to transfiguration. You don't say, be better. You say, burn. Burn away what isn't yours. Burn away what was taught, expected, forced. Burn until what remains is real, and then create. Create yourself like a sculptor facing a block of stone, knowing the shape is already within, not imposed, but released. That is why, over a century later, you are not just remembered, you are needed. In a world obsessed with control, you remind us of chaos. In a world drowning in distraction, you speak of depth. Ben, in a world afraid of death, you speak of eternal recurrence, not to terrify, but to test. Because the only true measure of life, you said, is whether we would choose it again. And the only way to say yes is to live it fully, without apology, without illusion, without shrinking. You were never asking us to be like you. You were asking us to be like ourselves, but more fiercely, more honestly, more fully than we ever imagined. And for those who are brave enough to answer, your voice will always be there, in the pain, in the clarity, in the silence, still whispering, you must become who you are. And in that whisper soft, unwavering, like wind through alpine trees, your legacy pulses forward. It doesn't end in Weimar, nor with your grave beneath the old churchyard, stone in Rican. It doesn't end with the fading of your body, or even with the silence of madness that swallowed your final years. Because what you created cannot be buried. It lives not in the dust of your books, but in the minds you set ablaze. You knew this, somehow, even as your friends abandoned you, even as your publishers refused to print your manuscripts, even as your body betrayed you knew. You once wrote, I am not a man. I am dynamite. And you were right. You planted charges under the foundations of morality, religion, metaphysics, and waited, not for destruction, but for release. You didn't want chaos for its own sake. That's a common misreading. You didn't believe in senseless rebellion, in tearing down the old just to dance in the rubble. You believed in overcoming, in tearing down illusions, so that new truths could be born. Not objective, eternal truths, but created truths. Truths that grow from the individual, that are lived, not dictated. And so your writing was never neutral. It was a war cry, spiritual scream, a call to those wandering in the wasteland, left behind by dying gods and crumbling systems. You didn't write for comfort. You wrote for transformation. That's why your books still feel so alive. When people open the gay science, Bohr, Zarathustra, or Beyond Good and Evil, they don't just read, they enter. They fall into a kind of dialogue, even an argument. They don't agree with everything. They're not meant to. You never wanted agreement. You wanted awakening. You said, "You have your way. I have my way." As for the right way, the correct way, and the only way does not exist. That's not moral relativism. It's radical ownership. It means no one can give you your path. Not God, not the state, not Nietzsche, only you. And the price of that freedom is responsibility, its weight. And you bore that weight first, so others would know it could be borne. You were not a cynic. You were not a nihilist. You were not a destroyer. You were a maker. You believed that after the death of God, we had two choices: fall into despair or rise into creation. And you chose the second. But you knew how hard that path would be. You knew it would mean loneliness, misunderstanding, failure. You once wrote, "He who climbs upon the highest mountains laughs at all tragedies, real or imaginary." But that laughter wasn't mockery, it was defiance. It was the laughter of one who sees everything, the horror, the absurdity, the beauty, and chooses still to affirm, even when the world said no, even when your own mind turned against you, even when your body became a prison. You kept writing, you kept climbing, you kept becoming, and so your life becomes a kind of myth, but not the sanitized myth of heroism. It's the real myth, the myth of the one who descends into the underworld, loses everything, and returns with fire. You gave that fire to the world, and the world is still learning how to carry it in every field. Your name echoes in literature, where your rhythm and imagery reshaped what philosophy could be. In psychology, where your exploration of drives, repression, guilt, and the unconscious anticipated Freud and Jung. In political theory, where your warnings about the herd and the will to power still spark debate. In theology, where you forced faith to confront itself honestly or perish. Even science, especially evolutionary biology and neuroscience, has seen reflections of your ideas. You spoke of instincts before Darwin's ideas were fully absorbed. Into culture, you saw consciousness not as the crown of existence, but as something that evolved for survival, a tool, not a truth-teller, you said. Thinking is merely a refined form of feeling. And now, generations later, neuroscientists nod. You were not a scientist, but you understood the animality of the human animal. And always, the deeper question lingered. What now? If God is dead, if truth is constructed, if morality is historical, if values are mutable, what do we do? You didn't give easy answers. You gave tasks, Create yourself, face the abyss, love your fate, affirm life. These are not slogans. They are trials, and they are not for everyone. You knew that, too. You said, the higher we soar, the smaller we appear to those who cannot fly. You weren't arrogant. You were honest about the cost of greatness. You knew most people would not want to think deeply, would not want to live without illusion, would not want to create their own values. It's too hard, too lonely, too unstable. Most people will always prefer the warmth of the herd to the cold light of becoming. But you still wrote for them, not because they would follow you, but because some would, a few. Those few you called the free spirits. And in every generation they come, lost, wandering, disillusioned, searching. They stumble upon you, not through school, but by accident, in a bookstore, in a dark night of the soul, in a sentence that cracks something open inside. And when they read you, really read you, they feel it. You saw them. You named their crisis before they were born. You lived it, survived it, burned for it tarned, left behind a trail of words like sparks. And that's why you're more than just a historical figure. You're a presence. You are the shadow behind every real question, the breath behind every honest doubt, the fire behind every self who dares to become. And in the end, that is your immortality, not the grave in Racken, not the archive in Vile, not the misuses of your name or the statues or citations, but in that trembling voice inside a person's chest that dares, for the first time, to say, I will not be what I was told to be. I will become who I am. And when they say it, you are there, not as a ghost in the way people often mean a pale echo or distant memory, but as something much more intimate. You become part of the bloodstream of thought. You flow through the tension in a question, the breath before a bold decision, the silent moment when someone stands alone in the face of their own becoming. That is where your presence is strongest, not in crowds, not in applause, but in solitude, because your work was always a dialogue with solitude. You wrote from it, into it, and for it. You knew what it meant to be exiled from the world, not by force, but by nature, not because you hated people, but because the truth you sought could not survive the noise. You withdrew. You lived in boarding, rooms, high mountain chalets, tiny rented flats, alone with your pain, your migraines, your trembling hands, but also alone with your clarity, your vision. You often said that solitude is the price of greatness, but you never romanticized it. You knew its coldness. You knew the aching absence of warmth, of closeness. You longed for it sometimes. Lou Salome touched something deep in you, not only because she was brilliant and free, but because she saw Yuan still didn't stay. That wound was never truly spoken, but it echoed in your later writing. The idea that even love could not survive the weight of who you were becoming. And so you turned even that heartbreak into insight. You wrote, it is not a lack of love, but a lack of friendship that makes unhappy marriages. And behind that line is your whole life. A man who could not be held by ordinary relationships. Because his thought broke through the walls of ordinary life, it would be easy to think of you as too severe, too harsh, too abstract. But those who read deeply, who don't just cherry-pick the hard words, the slaps and provocations, they find the tenderness to dot, because beneath the fire there was always love. Not sentimental love, not soft, but fierce, tragic, radiant love for life itself. You didn't worship life the way others do. You didn't call it good. You called it necessary. You said yes to its horror, its suffering, its chaos, because it was real. And you would rather have real pain than false peace. You once wrote, "The secret of the greatest fruitfulness and the greatest enjoyment of existence is to live dangerously." And that is your ethic. Not recklessness, but vitality. To stand on the edge of everything. Dare thought, to dare feeling, to dare transformation. And that danger for you was also joy. People forget that about you. They remember the stern face, the biting aphorisms, but you laughed often, deeply. Your writing is filled with laughter. Zarathustra is saturated with it. Not cynical laughter, not mockery, but the laughter of one who has seen the bottom of things and decided still to sing. You once said, "I would believe only in a God who could dance." That line is more than cleverness. It is your theology, your anti-theology. A God who dances is not a judge, not a master, not a punisher. A God who dances is life itself, moving, shifting, rhythmic, uncontrollably. And that is what you worshipped, not certainty, but becoming, not stability, but movement, not peace, but the joy that comes from facing the storm and dancing anyway. And yet for all your brilliance, for all your courage, you were not spared. Your collapse in 1889 was not just a tragedy of illness. It was the end point of a life lived at the highest voltage. For decades, you had pushed your body beyond its limit. You had stared too long into truth without blinking. You had carried the burden of your own fire with no one to help bear it. And eventually, it broke you. The moment in Turin, the horse, the embrace, the tears, it has become mythic. But it wasn't just madness. It was a release. The moment when the storm you had kept inside for so long finally escaped. After that, the words stopped. The philosopher fell silent. For the last 11 years of your life, you existed like a ghost in your own body. And yet, the words you had written in those last years continued to erupt into the world. The Antichrist. Your savage critique of Christianity as the religion of the weak, the sick, the dying. Not because you hated Christ, you admired him, but because you hated what had been built in his name. A system of guilt, shame, and denial. Twilight of the idols, your final hammer blow against the idols of European thought. Socrates, reason, moral truth. You struck them all, not to destroy, but to clear the ground for something new. Exi homo your, strange, beautiful self-requiem. Why I am so wise, why I am so clever. People thought you were mad already. But they didn't understand. You were playing. You were laughing. You were trying to tell the world one last time who you were before the darkness claimed you, and even the will to power. A book you never finished, never authorized. Your sister stitched it together from scraps, but still. In those scraps are pages that blaze, pages that burn, pages that dare to imagine a world where value is created, not received, where strength is not cruelty, but the power to say yes to suffering. Today, we still misread you. People want you to be easy, to fit into categories. Was he left or right? Was he liberal or authoritarian? Was he atheist or religious? But you escaped all those categories because you were not interested in answers. You were interested in freedom, and freedom for you meant responsibility. It meant creating meaning with no guarantee. It meant facing the world without a net, and so people come to you at the edge, not when life is easy, but when it's broken, when the old stories have failed, when they're looking into the abyss and hearing only silence. And then your words arrive, not to rescue them, but to challenge them, to ask, can you say yes to this too? And if they can, if they do, some new begins. That is why you endure. That is why your books are never truly closed. Because for some, your words are not just read, they are lived, and they change everything. The story ends, and if you are still here and fully awake, then you are very patient or very interested in the story. If that's the case, please leave a like and subscribe so you can hear more from me, and because they will fire me if you don't. Now, I will leave the rest of you who have fallen asleep to rest with this fire effect. Enjoy and have a nice dream.